Alright, so in this video, we're going to talk about the beginning of the Cold War. So you should be taking some notes, writing down beyond just plain bullet points, listening to what I'm saying, pausing the video, going back if you need to. Alright, the beginning of the Cold War. Alright, so it all starts with the end of World War II. As you recall, go here. The end of World War II, we have the Allied powers. We got France, which fell very quickly to Germany, Great Britain, the United States, and those were the main Allied powers. And then they were and of course the USSR. And then they defeated Germany, Italy, and Japan, the Axis powers. And they defeated Germany and Italy first, and then the Americans defeated the Japanese next. And they required the Axis unconditional surrenders. And so Great Britain, France, the United States, even though they were allies with the USSR, with Stalin, does not mean that they were friends. The only reason they were on the same side was because they had a common enemy, and that was Hitler. That was Germany. At this point in time, Germany had invaded the USSR twice, once in World War I and once in World War II. Again, even after promising and signing a non-aggression pact, they did it again. And so that's what drew all of the Allied powers together. Well, leading up to Germany and Germany's defeat, it was only a couple months before Germany's surrender. We were going to have the big three, FDR, so the United States, Churchill, Britain, and Stalin is right here. The big three are going to meet at the Yalta Conference, and they have to. It's at this point it's pretty clear that they're going to win the war. And so what they have to do is they have to meet and determine what the post-World War II is going to look like. What are the borders going to look like? What is each country going to get out of this war, since they're all going to be on the winning side? They have to kind of share in the spoils of war. And they got to talk about how do we set up a system that will prevent another world war? Because obviously last time we did not set up a system that was very strong, and we're going to have World War II. So at the Yalta Conference, Stalin gets Eastern Europe, essentially. So as the USSR in World War II, after the Battle of Stalingrad, starts to push back Germany, Germany at this time had taken over all of Eastern Europe for Lebensraum, for the living space for the Germans. And they pillaged and they plundered the Eastern European countries. And when the USSR started to push Germany back and started to go towards Berlin, the Soviet Union didn't just give those Eastern European countries their independence. They just occupied them and replaced Germany as the country that occupied them. And the USSR is going to want to keep these territories under their control so that Germany can never invade them again. It kind of serves as a buffer, a protective zone. That's what he really wanted. And at this conference, at the Yalta Conference, Churchill and FDR had agreed. All right. They're also going to create, of course, the United Nations, which we talked about last unit. The United Nations, was a much stronger organization, peacekeeping organization, after World War II than the League of Nations was after World War I. And in this United Nations, what we're going to see is the Soviet Union and the United States, they're going to set aside their differences, and about 50 countries, 50 nations are going to form the United Nations. And its intention was to protect the members against aggression. The idea was, we're not going to go to another world war. We're going to talk about our issues and keep the peace. And what they're going to do is it's going to create a security council as well, under the heading of the United Nations. And it's about 11 members, 11 nations, and the Security Council is going to have the power to investigate and settle actual disputes. The 5 permanent members are going to be the United States, Britain, China, France, and the Soviet Union. So 1, 2, 3, China and the United States, which are not on this. The problem is it wasn't actually super strong at controlling any major power. It really only influenced the lesser powers. So the United States, Britain, and France couldn't really control the USSR or China, because each one of those main powers also had a veto power. So 4 of those big powers, it was actually a total of 15, but the 5 that were permanent were the ones I just mentioned, could veto, and one veto could mean the deal's not going to go through. And so it was actually very hard to prevent the big powers from being able to prevent another big power from doing what they wanted. However, it really did provide some stability to the continent of Europe, and provided the necessary mediation. If something's kind of flaring up, the UN would send peacekeeping organizations and forces to settle the disputes. And so it really did help Europe rebuild. So what is a Cold War? A Cold War essentially is a war between 2 different sides, and they are not going to fight directly. That's what we mean by cold. And we'll talk about why they don't fight directly. They don't fight directly because of nuclear weapons. But that's what it means by Cold War. So the Cold War is between the 2 superpowers, between the Soviet Union. After World War II, the Soviet Union came out as extremely strong, and, of course, the United States. So make sure you write those down as the 2 superpowers. And they had a lot of major differences, despite being on the same side of World War I. Right after World War II ended, very quickly, this rivalry emerged between the Soviet Union and America. It was already even starting to form during World War II. As the Allied powers were moving towards Germany and the Soviet Union was also pinching Germany, it was almost a race to see who can get there first and claim the greatest victory, and therefore claim the greatest and benefits after the war. And it's a war between ideas. There's nothing that the United States per se did directly against the Soviet Union that made them want to fight the United States, and vice versa. There's nothing the Soviet Union, they didn't send troops over and attack our Pearl Harbor. It wasn't a direct thing. It was a fight between what we felt was ideology, belief systems. We have 2 different major belief systems that are going to be rivals. The political belief system, make sure you write this down, is the difference between democracy, good morning, and communism. United States goes with democracy, this idea that everyone should have an equal say in their government and should choose their leaders. And of course, the Soviet Union, communism, and the Soviet Union, dictatorship. I apologize. Make sure you write democracy versus dictatorship. Democracy versus dictatorship. As a political system, the Soviet Union and many other countries believe that dictatorship is better equipped at dealing with crises like the Great Depression or like a war, where the government has to take a lot more power to win the war, and has to take that power over the economy, over people's free speech, and things like that. So democracy versus dictatorship. Economically speaking, it's between capitalism in the United States, that free trade, private, the ability to earn a profit, work hard, earn a profit, keep your private property, and that system incentivizes you to work harder, and that will grow a very wealthy economy with minimal government involvement. That's capitalism, if you recall. The government is not incredibly involved in the economy. That goes with the United States. Capitalism versus, and of course, the Soviet Union's model of communism. This idea that the government, well, socialism and then communism is radically extreme, where there are no social classes. It's a dictatorship. The Soviet Union is a dictatorship essentially amongst the working class. There is no such thing as private property. Stalin, as we've learned, took everyone's land, took everyone's equipment, and made them meet certain production quotas to force that agricultural revolution. And once that happened, he moved people to the cities to increase their production in the cities, to force the industrial revolution. He had so much power over their lives, but it really paid off, especially by World War II. They were an industrialized country. But nobody had any private property, and politically, no one had any say in their government. So it goes between capitalism and communism, economically speaking. So the United States and the Soviet Union were rivals, and they're trying to spread their political and economic systems. Communism, as we have talked about in the past, is an international movement. Workers of the world unite. It's supposed to extend and unify all the workers beyond the political boundaries. We're going to see China fall to communism very early, right after World War II. And there's this sense that communism is spreading around the world. Communism is very appealing to people who are poor, to countries that do not have a ton of wealth. In the United States, it's not appealing to people in the United States who already have a lot of wealth. They don't want to let go of what they already have. But it is appealing after World War II. It just destroys a lot of places around the world with all of its destruction. And everyone's trying to rebuild. Communism is going to be very appealing to those countries that don't have enough, and they just feel like maybe the people at the bottom, maybe we should all unify together and work together for all the things that we need, and no one's allowed to have more than the others. That mentality is very appealing to the people of Europe whose lives have been destroyed after World War II. So when we talk about the beginning of the Cold War, I don't really like, let's see. I'm going to change this. Possible misunderstanding. So when we say the beginning, it's not quite clear who actually started this rivalry after World War II. It's possible that there was a misunderstanding. So as we talked about, if this is the Soviet Union and this is the line, right? And after World War II, they invaded Germany, and they took all of these territories right here, and they did not give them back. And they took control over these Eastern European countries. And Stalin claimed that the Soviet Union needed to keep control of Poland and these countries to prevent Germany from being able to invade them once again. And if you believe that, then you believe that if you believe that it was just a defensive measure and that the Soviet Union is not just trying to imperialize, take over other people's stuff, like Hitler did, then you could see how the United States possibly overreacted and misinterpreted the Soviet actions. At this point, President Truman is the president, not FDR. And Truman was way more suspicious and distrusting of Stalin than FDR was. FDR had already passed away, and Truman was the vice president, now president. So if all you want is this protective barrier, that's not an aggressive policy whatsoever. But the Americans thought the Soviets were trying to become expansionists. And so, from their perspective, Germany and Hitler, in the beginning of World War II, started to expand into Austria and then Czechoslovakia and then Poland, and Britain and France and the former allies did nothing to stop them. Remember the policy of appeasement. And America did not want to make that same mistake again. And so if you view what the Soviet Union was doing by taking over these Eastern European countries as aggressive instead of defensive, then you could argue that it was the Soviet Union that started the Cold War, and that the American response was appropriate. What the Americans and the United States did is they developed this policy of containment. Containment means how do I put it? To limit communism where it has already spread. To stop the spread of communism. Make sure you write that down. To stop the spread of communism. Where communism has already spread is going to be left alone. They don't have the power to fight the Soviet Union, nor do they want to. But they don't want the Soviet Union to turn all of these countries communist, and then all of these countries communist, and then China communist. They want to try to keep everyone what they already have. They do not want communism to spread. And so what they're going to do that is they're going to do it with the Truman Doctrine, named after President Truman. After World War II, Europe is going to be completely destroyed, and America is going to give lots of military support to Greece and Turkey. That's the Truman Doctrine. American military support to Greece and Turkey to prevent them from becoming communism. So Greece is right here and Turkey is right here. Kind of cut off from the rest of Western Europe. And they're very vulnerable to communism, as we talked about before. When you're rebuilding and you're poor, communism is very appealing. And it would be very good for America if these countries stayed democratic, because they are really right beneath the Soviet Union. And they have access to the water. So strategically, they're very important geographically speaking as well. But so Truman's giving military support to Greece and Turkey, and any area threatened by communism, and it works. But they actually do more than that. America goes so far as to put nuclear weapons in Turkey, which is right beneath the Soviet Union. It's very threatening to them. And so what the Soviet Union, from their perspective, America's just giving everyone military support so they don't become communists. From the Soviet Union perspective, they're just being surrounded by democracies, surrounded by their enemies. And so they view that as extremely threatening. We're also going to talk about the Marshall Plan. So this idea of containment has two sub-policies. The Truman Doctrine, which is military support for any area, specifically Greece and Turkey, threatened by communism. And the Marshall Plan is a very ingenious plan. It is American money to help rebuild Western Europe. What America's going to do is they are going to cancel all of their wartime debt. So we're not going to have major inflation. They're not going to overprint money. And instead of, if you remember after World War I, and the Dawes Plan, which gave loans to Germany to help them rebuild, which really helped. These aren't loans. The Germans had to repay that money to the Americans, which then, when the Great Depression hit, it made everything worse. The Marshall Plan is just money. It's just aid given freely to these countries to help them rebuild. So obviously the United Kingdom has a ton of money. This is representative. France has a ton of money, our two biggest allies. And as you can see, not so much in Eastern Europe at all, because the Soviet Union would not allow any of these Eastern European countries to take any American aid. And the Soviet Union just sees America as buying people's democracy, right? If we give you this money, are you going to stay democratic? And that is essentially the idea. It's to prevent these countries who are really suffering from falling for the appeal of communism. If you have enough and you rebuild quick enough so that people have some wealth and some private property, you're not going to be tempted to give it all up and switch to communism. And it is very altruistic. It is very good for them, but it's also self-serving in many ways. At this point in time, the United States controlled about half of the world economy. A lot of these people are going to spend that money back on buying American-made goods. And so in some ways, it's going to come straight back to the United States. But the Marshall Plan is just economic aid to help rebuild Europe, to help rebuild Western Europe. Make sure you write that down. And it works incredibly well. It's incredibly successful. It's almost like an economic miracle. Not only is this money going to help these countries recover, they were going to recover with unprecedented growth rates from before the world wars. Yugoslavia is right here in this border. It does receive some Marshall Plan aid. And they are a communist country, but they're a communist country that really has this leader that just rebukes all of the Soviet Union's attempts at influencing Yugoslavia. And so they do take a little bit of aid, despite being a communist country, only because they're not under Stalin's control. So outside the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. All right. Let's see. Oh yeah, so this is just in the numbers. There's a couple loans, but there's way more grants than there are loans. If that makes any sense. Grants are just extra money, free money that we're giving to you or just aiding to you. Okay, let's see where are we? Okay, so the Soviet Union. Oh, I like this map. So this is from the North Pole. This is Canada. This is the USSR. They really are on opposite sides of the world. And then as you can see, the Pacific Ocean is huge, as we've already talked about. So the Soviets, they are going to start to feel very encircled and very threatened by the United States. The United States is going to have, one second. Is going to have lots of submarines, lots of weapons all over in Western Europe. And they're also going to aid, and we'll get talked about it in just 1 second as well. They're also going to aid Japan. Actually, are we going to talk about? Yeah, we are going to talk about it. And so from the Soviet Union perspective, is we got all these, we're trying to surround them on this side, and then we're going to surround them on this side with Japan economic aid and keeping Japan non-communist. And so what he's going to do is Stalin's going to create Eastern European satellites called Soviet satellites. So Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, those are what we are going to call satellite countries. They're buffer countries for the Soviet Union, and they're going to kind of tinker in their elections and put in place governments that are completely loyal to the Soviet Union. So they have governments that are completely loyal to the Soviet Union. So again, this is like another example of very much of, a sphere of influence. The Soviet Union isn't controlling Hungary directly, but they pretty much get in power someone who is loyal to the Soviet Union. And these people, the Soviet Union is looking at these countries as very imperialistically. These countries are going to have to provide the natural resources the Soviet Union needs, and they're going to have to buy the products of the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union wants them to buy. Very much like a colony, except with a little bit less direct government. And what this is going to do is this creation of these wall of satellite nations, it's going to create this metaphor that we call the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain was an ideological barrier that separated the East and the West. It's a metaphor. It's just a division, a barrier between the East and the West, all of the communist countries and all of the non-communist democratic countries. There is going to be a Berlin Wall that's created in Germany that divides Western and Eastern Europe, but that's not built for much later. This idea of the Iron Curtain comes up much sooner. And it's not a real curtain. It's not a real wall. It's a metaphor. So in Germany and in Berlin, which is the capital to Germany, we're gonna see Germany divided between the USSR, the Soviet Union, yellow is them, the United States, France, and Britain on the west. And the same thing, they're going to divide Berlin as well. So you can see this is Berlin, makes up that little star right there. The problem is Berlin is in the eastern part, is in the Soviet Union part. And so it's really what we're going to see is the whole point of this is they're going to remove their troops, at least the Allies are, the United States, Britain, France. They're going to remove their allies, and they are going to occupy Germany and Berlin really as a temporary measure after World War II to purge all Nazi influence. The idea is root out all of the former Nazis to make sure we are not going to have a flare-up after World War II ends, and then create a self-government, let them rule themselves, and then move out. That's the goal. That was part of the peace treaty after World War II. And the problem is they do the same thing to Berlin, and Berlin is in the Soviet Union part of Germany. And all the Allies actually, they had access to roads that went to their side, to their part, western side of West Berlin. And what Stalin is going to do is he's going to blockade them to the point that the western part of Berlin isn't going to have any access to water or food or medicine. So what the Allies are going to have to do is, it's called the Berlin Airlift, is airlift planes. They're going to fly over and then drop down supplies. We might even see some airlifts happen in this Ukrainian crisis soon, if the supply lines are cut. All right, and at this point, it's not Stalin, it's Khrushchev. He's going to build a wall around Western Berlin so that the Eastern Berliners cannot see the other side. Because before this wall is seen, you can see how much more wealthy the Western side is. You know, the Western countries they're going to do the same thing that they've always done. They're going to aid with a lot of money, and they're going to rebuild and make it flourishing after World War II. Whereas the Soviet Union this is their time for revenge. Germany has invaded them twice at this point, and they're going to strip Germany and strip their side of Berlin of all resources and make their people suffer. And so the division between Western and Eastern Germany, Western and Eastern Berlin is going to be stark. And it's going to be a perfect analogy for the difference between Western economies and democracies and Eastern dictatorship and communism. And so the East is going to have still a ton of poverty because the Soviet Union is trying to punish the people, is trying to make those Germans suffer. And the West is trying to help rebuild them with all of this aid money. And by the end of the Cold War, the West Germany is going to be one of the wealthiest nations in the world. It's going to be an extremely productive economy. Extremely productive. All right, and the last thing that we're going to talk about is Japan. Now, if you remember, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, were bombed. The Allies also firebombed Tokyo. So after World War II, Japan is completely destroyed and really needs to help recovering. Um, and the Japanese military is completely uh, discredited after World War II. They just lost so terribly, and they'd been bombarded by all this propaganda and seeing the Westerners as subhuman and seeing them as the enemies. But after World War II, Japan and the United States actually form an incredibly great alliance. Um, the United States decides to occupy Japan for a while, guide the writing of their constitution. They create a parliamentary kind of system like Britain has, um, flood Japan with economic aid to help them rebuild, and they're going to see a really strong recovery. And the point of doing all of this is to provide a buffer, essentially, against the Soviet Union. So if you see this map, now once Japan, we make sure Japan does not go communist. We have surrounded surrounded the Soviet Union on both sides. If Japan is our strongest ally over here, and we have lots of Western allies over here, we have surrounded them on all fronts. That's the idea. Let's see. So we give them a constitutional monarchy, and they're our United States ally. I think that's all we really need to talk about. Oh yeah, so by the economic success, by the 70s, Japan had built the third most productive economy. By the 90s, it was the second most productive next to the United States. So after we completely destroyed their country in World War II, they're the next best economy to us a couple decades later. And they were demilitarized. The United States said they're not allowed to have more than an army of more than 100,000 men to protect, and that the United States was going to protect their security. Questionable, but we did have, by 1951, we're going to pull out of Japan and no longer occupy them, and they're going to be one of our greatest allies moving forward. All right, so as that was the beginning of the Cold War. And next class, we're going to talk about some of the battles actually fought between these two sides, communists and democracies, or communists and capitalists, dictatorships and democracy. All right. Make sure you got that all down and you took good notes, and you check on your homework and your classwork and make sure you get everything done to me. Thank you.